It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Is that a knockoff? Grant Sterling sneered, fingering Sloane Sterling's collar in front of the country club's founding members. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the eyes of everyone at the brunch table. Grant stood there in his pristine tennis whites, the sweater tied over his shoulders a calculated shade of cream that screamed of heritage and unearned confidence. He looked every bit the man of the year the local papers were calling him. To the world, he was the golden boy of the Sterling Empire. To the woman sitting across from him, he was a thief in a designer costume. Sloane didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line of tempered steel. She wore a charcoal silk blouse, no logos, no visible branding, just a cut so precise it could only have been made by hand in a quiet atelier in Milan. It was the epitome of quiet luxury, a concept her brother was too loud to ever understand. "It's vintage, Grant," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that barely carried over the clink of silver against china. "Something you wouldn't recognize. It requires an appreciation for things that last longer than a season. It requires a paycheck you don't have," he shot back, leaning in close enough for Sloane to smell the gin on his breath, even at 11 in the morning. He turned to the table, raising his voice for the benefit of the 3 board members watching with amused detachment. "My sister has always had champagne tastes on a sparkling water budget. It's a good thing I keep her on the payroll at the firm, or she'd be wearing burlap." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter went around the table. Sloane felt the heat rise in her neck, but she didn't let it reach her face. She reached for her water glass, the crystal cold and sweating against her palm. She watched the condensation drip, a single bead tracing a path down the glass, mirroring the way her brother's arrogance was beginning to leak through his polished exterior. "Grant, leave your sister alone," Diana Sterling said, though there was no heat in the command. She sat at the head of the table, her blonde hair coiffed into a helmet of perfection that hadn't moved since 1994. She didn't look at Sloane. She was too busy adjusting Grant's collar, her fingers lingering with a doting pride that Sloane hadn't felt in a decade. "She's here to support you. We all are. This weekend is about your legacy." "My legacy," Grant repeated, puffing out his chest. "Which, let's be honest, is the only thing keeping the Sterling name relevant. Right, Dad?" Arthur Sterling, sitting at the far end of the table, didn't look up from his poached eggs. He gave a vague, noncommittal grunt, his silence a heavy shroud that had covered the family for years. He was a man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life, leaving Sloane to navigate the sharks alone. "Sloane, dear," Diana said, finally turning her gaze toward her daughter. Her eyes were like chips of blue ice, scanning Sloane's face for any sign of the clutter she so despised. "Since you're not on the official program for the gala tonight, I've put together a list of errands. Grant's dry cleaning needs to be picked up. The tuxedo had a faint scent of tobacco, and I need you to personally oversee the floral arrangements at the ballroom. The florist is incompetent, and I can't have the Sterling image tarnished by wilted lilies." Sloane felt the familiar sting of the blood betrayal. She was the one who had spent the last 6 months scrubbing Grant's reputation clean after his latest misunderstanding with a junior associate. She was the one who handled the press, the legal threats, and the digital footprints. Yet, in the eyes of her mother, she was nothing more than a glorified personal assistant who was too plain to be in the family portraits. "I have my own meetings today, Mother," Sloane said quietly. Grant snorted into his mimosa. "Meetings? With who?" "The cat. Sloane, you're a fixer. You're the person who stands in the shadows so people like me can stand in the light. Don't get confused about your place in this family." He reached out, condescendingly patting her cheek. His skin was clammy, and his touch made Sloane's skin crawl. She waited until he pulled away, then she slowly reached into her handbag and felt the cold, hard edges of her phone. It buzzed against her fingertips, 3 short pulses, the signal from Julian Vance. Sloane took a slow breath, the scent of the lilies on the table suddenly cloying and sweet, like a funeral. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, noting the slight tremor in his hand and the way he preened for the witnesses at the table. He thought he was the architect of his own fortune. He had no idea that the foundation was already turning to sand. "You're right, Grant," Sloane said, a small, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I do spend a lot of time in the shadows, but you forget one thing about the dark." Grant smirked, signaling the waiter for another round. "And what's that, sis?" "You can see everything from there," she whispered, "and nobody ever sees you coming." She stood up, the sound of her chair legs scraping against the marble floor like a whetstone against a blade. She didn't wait for a dismissal. She didn't look back at her mother's shocked expression or her father's bowed head. As she walked toward the exit of the club, her heels clicking with rhythmic, lethal precision, Sloane pulled out her phone. She swiped the screen, opening an encrypted folder that Julian had spent all night preparing. There, in high-definition black and white, were the offshore wire transfers Grant thought were hidden behind 3 layers of shell companies. She paused at the heavy oak doors, looking out over the manicured lawn where Grant would be crowned Man of the Year in less than 12 hours. She tapped a single command on the screen, "Begin Phase 1. 2 days," she murmured to the empty hallway. 2 days until you realize that the person you thought was a knockoff is the only one who actually owns the brand. She stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, the plan already in motion. The Sterling legacy was about to have its most public and most permanent rebranding. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sloane Sterling's minimalist penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the white marble. The air smelled of expensive, bitter espresso and the faint, ozone scent of high-end electronics. She stood by the window, her silk robe a whisper of charcoal gray against her skin, watching the city wake up. On the glass coffee table, a tablet glowed with the morning's top business headlines. Grant Sterling's face was everywhere. He looked smug in his designer tennis whites, leaning against a mahogany desk in a staged photo for Asterisk Elite Ledger. The headline read, "The Prodigal Architect, How Grant Sterling Revitalized the Sterling Legacy." Sloane felt a familiar phantom pain in her chest. The revitalization mentioned in the article was a line-by-line recreation of the 3-year plan she had written during her lonely nights in the London office. He hadn't just stolen her seat at the table, he had stolen the very thoughts from her head. "He's already scrubbed your name from the internal servers," a voice said from the shadows of the kitchen. Julian Vance stepped into the light, his fingers dancing across a slim, black laptop. He didn't look like a tech mogul. He looked like a predator in a tailored suit. He set the laptop down next to her coffee. "Every file, every email, every digital footprint of your contribution to the Aegis project. According to the company directory as of 6:00 a.m., you never worked there." Sloane's fingers tightened around her cup. The heat of the ceramic was the only thing keeping her grounded. "My mother's doing, no doubt. Diana doesn't believe in loose ends. She believes in branding, and right now, the brand is Grant. Then she's going to hate the rebranding I've started," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. He turned the screen toward her. "I tracked the offshore transfers Grant used to buy that vintage yacht last month. He didn't use his inheritance. He diverted funds from the Sterling Foundation's charity wing, the one your father uses to fund children's hospitals." Sloane leaned in, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her cold, steady eyes. "He's stealing from the sick to fund a trophy. How very on brand for him." Her phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID made her jaw ache. Diana Sterling. Sloane answered, her voice a mask of professional neutrality. "Good morning, Mother." "Sloane, dear," Diana's voice was sharp, vibrating with a forced, manic cheerfulness. "I'm calling about the Man of the Year gala tomorrow. I've sent a dress over to your apartment. It's a lovely beige lace, very modest. I want you to make sure you stay in the background during Grant's acceptance speech. We can't have any distractions. And Sloane, don't bother trying to log into the Foundation portal. We've had a security breach, and Arthur thought it best to limit access to core family members only." The insult was a physical weight, a public demotion delivered in the private safety of a phone call. Sloane looked at the offshore wire transfers on Julian's screen, the evidence of Grant's felony. "I understand perfectly, Mother," Sloane said, her gaze fixed on a transfer for $2 million. "I wouldn't want to distract anyone from what Grant truly deserves." "Good girl," Diana snapped before hanging up. Sloane set the phone down. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of a brewing storm. She reached out and touched the cold, brushed aluminum of Julian's laptop. "Is Phase 1 ready?" she asked. "The seeds are planted," Julian replied. "The journalists have been tipped about a major anonymous donation being announced at the gala. When Grant stands up to take his bow, the world is going to see exactly where that money came from and where it went." Sloane walked to the closet, pulling out a dress that was anything but beige. It was a structured midnight black gown that cost more than Grant's yacht fuel. It was the armor of a woman who was done being invisible. $2 million, Sloane murmured, her voice rhythmic and lethal. "That's the price of his soul. I wonder what the price of the Sterling name will be by tomorrow night." She checked her watch. 24 hours. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and the air felt electric, like the moment before lightning strikes a lightning rod. She wasn't just going to the gala to watch him win. She was going to be the one who finally turned out the lights. "Julian," she said, her eyes reflecting the cold city skyline. "Call Mrs. Gable. Tell her to bring the physical ledgers to the safe house. If Grant thinks a digital scrub is enough to erase me, he's about to learn that some stains never come out." 2 days later, the air inside Julian's private tech suite felt sterile, smelling of cooling fans and the faint, metallic tang of high-end circuitry. Sloane Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection ghosting against the glass. She wore a charcoal silk blouse, unbranded, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that cost thousands but whispered its value rather than screaming it. "The digital scrub was thorough," Julian Vance said, his fingers dancing across a haptic keyboard. He didn't look up, but the tension in his shoulders was visible. "Grant didn't just delete the files. He used a military-grade overwrite. If I didn't have the backdoor access you gave me months ago, we'd be staring at a void." Sloane turned, her gaze falling on the heavy, brass-bound ledger sitting on the mahogany desk. It looked like an antique, out of place among the glowing monitors. "Grant always was better at spending money than understanding how it's tracked. He thinks if he can't see it on a screen, it doesn't exist." The heavy security door hissed open, and Mrs. Gable stepped inside. The former housekeeper looked smaller than she had in the Sterling mansion, but her eyes were sharp, carrying the weight of 30 years of secrets. She clutched a leather satchel to her chest like a shield. "I found them, Sloane," the older woman whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She placed the satchel on the desk next to the ledger. "The original receipts. Every offshore transfer Grant authorized using your father's forged signature. He thought I'd thrown them in the incinerator 3 years ago." Sloane ran a finger over the rough leather. This was the physical weight of her brother's soul, a collection of paper and ink that proved he hadn't just built a career on her labor, but on the systematic theft of their father's legacy. "You're sure about the gala?" Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes darting to Julian. "The Sterlings. They don't lose, dear. Your mother, Diana, she's already told the press that Grant is the sole visionary of the firm." "They only win because I've been the one holding the cards for them," Sloane said, her voice like a scalpel. "Tomorrow night, I'm simply folding my hand. Julian, is the projection sequence ready?" "Sync to the venue's main server," Julian replied, finally looking up. His eyes reflected the green glow of 1,000 lines of code. "The moment Grant steps onto that stage for his Visionary of the Year speech, the house lights will belong to us." Sloane nodded, but the preparation wasn't finished. She needed to look the monster in the eye one last time. An hour later, Sloane stepped into the foyer of the Sterling estate. The scent of lilies was overwhelming, Diana's favorite, a cloying floral mask for the rot beneath the floorboards. In the grand dining room, Grant was standing on a pedestal while 2 tailors pinned a tuxedo made of midnight blue velvet. "Ah, the prodigal failure returns," Grant Sterling said, not even turning his head as his sister entered. He checked his reflection in the gold leaf mirror, adjusting a diamond cufflink that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. "I heard you moved into a loft in the industrial district. How? Gritty of you." The tailors chuckled dutifully. Grant thrived on an audience, even when he paid for. "I came to get the last of my things from the safe," Sloane said, her voice level. She walked past him, her heels clicking rhythmically on the Carrara marble. "Don't bother," Grant snapped, his ego flaring at her lack of reaction. He stepped off the pedestal, waving the tailors away with a dismissive flick of his hand. "I had the locks changed this morning. You don't have things here anymore, Sloane. You don't even have a name. I've spent the last 48 hours making sure every contact in the city knows you were retired for mental instability." He walked toward her, his presence looming, smelling of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "You were always the help, sister, the PR girl who cleaned up the messes. Well, the house is clean now, and there's no room for you at the table. Diana and Arthur have already signed the new trust papers. You're out, completely." Sloane didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, noticing the way his pupils dilated with the rush of his own perceived power. "You're right, Grant. The house is very clean, but you forgot one thing about cleaning." "And what's that?" He sneered, his lip curling in a mask of old money arrogance. "If you don't take out the trash," Sloane murmured, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying stillness, "it starts to smell. Enjoy the gala tomorrow. It's going to be a night the city never forgets." Grant laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Oh, I will. And you'll be watching from the sidewalk, won't you? If the security guards even let you that close." He turned back to the mirror, obsessed with his own image, already dismissing her as a ghost. He didn't see Sloane reach into her pocket and touch the cold, hard edge of the flash drive Julian had prepared. As she walked toward the door, she passed Arthur Sterling sitting in the library. Her father didn't look up from his paper. He didn't acknowledge the daughter who had spent a decade protecting his reputation from his son's greed. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and in doing so, he had chosen his own ruin. Sloane stepped out into the cool evening air, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind her. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Julian. "The architect is out of the building. Burn it down." She looked up at the darkened windows of the master suite, where she knew Diana was likely reviewing the guest list, crossing off names that no longer served the Sterling brand. 24 hours. Sloane got into her car, the engine purring with a low, predatory hum. The ledgers were safe. The witnesses were ready. The arrogance of the Sterling family had reached its zenith, and tomorrow, gravity would finally do its job. She felt a strange, cold peace settle over her. It wasn't just about the money Grant had stolen or the credit he had taken. It was about the look she knew would be on his face when he realized that the help hadn't just left the building. She had bought the foundation out from under it. The following afternoon, the air in the Sterling Foundation's penthouse office felt thick with the scent of lilies and expensive floor wax. Sloane Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline. She smoothed the front of her charcoal wool blazer, the fabric cool and unyielding beneath her fingertips. In her hand, she held a single, slim manila folder, the physical manifestation of the storm about to break. Grant Sterling sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of ancient mahogany, his attention fixed on a velvet-lined box. He lifted a pair of gold cufflinks, turning them to catch the light. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting into that familiar, condescending smirk that had once made her feel small. Today, it only made her feel focused. "The gala is less than 24 hours away, Sloane," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with the unearned confidence of a man who had never known a day of true consequence. "I hope you're here to tell me the press kits are perfect. The Sterling name needs to be spotless when I take the stage." Sloane set the folder on the edge of the desk. The sound of paper hitting wood was the only noise in the cavernous room. "I'm here to give you a choice, Grant. There's a discrepancy in the Foundation's offshore accounts." Specifically, the capital earmarked for the children's wing in Geneva. It seems to have migrated into your personal investment portfolio. Grant didn't even flinch. He leaned back, the leather of his executive chair creaking, a rich, expensive sound that filled the silence. Discrepancy, that's a very technical word for someone who usually handles dinner seating charts. I'm the face of this brand. My lifestyle is the marketing. If a few figures shifted to maintain that image, it's simply the cost of doing business. It's embezzlement, she said, her voice a low, steady hum. And the trail is wide enough for a blind auditor to follow. You should consider stepping down tonight. Cite health reasons, exhaustion, anything. If you do, the announcement tomorrow will be about your legacy, not your indictment. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the glass walls. You've always had a flair for the dramatic. Is this your way of trying to feel important? You're the architect of my public image, Sloane. If I fall, you're out of a job. You're the help. You're the shadow. Shadows don't threaten the light. The door swung open, the heavy brass handle clicking with a sharp, authoritative snap. Diana Sterling swept into the room, her signature scent of jasmine and cold steel preceding her. She didn't look at her daughter. Her eyes were fixed on the seating chart, displayed on the digital monitor. Sloane, why are you still here? Diana asked, her tone dismissive as she adjusted a diamond brooch on her lapel. I told you to finalize the floral arrangements, and I've decided you won't be sitting at the head table tomorrow. It's better for the Sterling brand if the focus remains on Grant and his father. We need to project a specific kind of family value, and your minimalist aesthetic is a bit too cold for the cameras. I was just giving Grant some advice on the foundation's integrity, Mother, Sloane replied, her gaze moving from the mother who had erased her to the brother who had robbed her. Diana waved a hand as if swatting away a fly. Integrity is for people who can't afford lawyers. Now, leave us. We have a legacy to polish. Sloane felt the weight of the digital key in her pocket. The one Julian Vance had confirmed was now active within the Sterling Foundation's main server. She looked at Grant, who was already back to admiring his cufflinks, and then at Diana, who was marking a red X through Sloane's name on the digital guest list. I'll leave you to it then, Sloane said. But remember, the higher you build on a hollow foundation, the faster the collapse. Go fix the flowers, Sloane, Grant called out without looking up. And make sure the champagne is cold. That's what we pay you for. She walked out of the office, the click of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. Outside, the evening air was crisp. She pulled out her phone and saw a message from Julian. The payload is synchronized. One click and the Sterling brand becomes a case study in federal crime. Are you ready? Sloane looked back at the glowing windows of the penthouse. She could see the two silhouettes inside, the mother and the son, so certain of their invincibility. She didn't feel anger anymore, only the cold, quiet peace of a job nearly finished. I'm ready, she whispered to the empty street. Let the gala begin. The following evening, the glass villa lived up to its name, a shimmering cage of floor-to-ceiling crystal perched over the city's skyline. The humidity of the late afternoon had been bled out by a massive industrial cooling system, leaving the air inside crisp, sterile and smelling faintly of expensive lilies and floor wax. Sloane Sterling arrived exactly 6 minutes after the official start time, stepping out of a nondescript black car that was immediately overshadowed by the roar of a vintage Italian sports car pulling up behind her. She didn't turn to look. She knew the sound of Grant's ego better than her own heartbeat. She smoothed the front of her charcoal silk gown. It was a masterpiece of construction, devoid of logos or recognizable patterns, the epitome of quiet luxury that her mother always mistook for a lack of ambition. In a room full of emeralds and oversized brand signatures, Sloane was a shadow, precisely as she intended to be. The foyer was already thick with the city's elite. Diana Sterling stood at the center of a semicircle of photographers, her laughter ringing out like a practice chime. She was draped in ivory lace that screamed matriarch, her hand resting possessively on the arm of Arthur Sterling. Her father looked as he always did, a man who had long ago traded his spine for a comfortable chair and a quiet life. He nodded vaguely at the guests, a ghost in a tuxedo, while his wife directed the room with the efficiency of a general. "Sloane, darling, there you are," Deanna said, her eyes scanning her daughter with the clinical detachment of an appraiser. She didn't move to hug her. Instead, she reached out and adjusted Sloane's collar, her fingers cold against Sloane's skin. "You look tidy, though perhaps a bit drab for the Foundation's 10-year anniversary. I told you the emerald would have photographed better." "I'm here to work, Diana," Sloane replied, her voice a calm, level contrast to her mother's performative trill. "Work? Heavens, no. Tonight is about the Sterling legacy," Diana whispered, her smile never wavering for the cameras. "I've told the senator you're still assisting Grant with his transition into the CEO role. Try to look supportive, not like you're calculating the cost of the catering. It's unseemly." Diana turned back to the photographers, literally stepping in front of Sloane to ensure her daughter was blocked from the frame. The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that it felt like a physical shove. Sloane watched her mother's back for a moment, the scent of Diana's heavy tuberose perfume clinging to the air like a warning. Sloane moved deeper into the ballroom, the sound of a string quartet playing Vivaldi providing a frantic, upbeat soundtrack to the simmering tension in her chest. She found Julian Vance near the tech mezzanine. He was dressed in a sharp, midnight blue suit, looking every bit the successful venture capitalist he pretended to be. To anyone else, they were just two professionals exchanging pleasantries. "The server is live," Julian murmured, his eyes tracking a waiter carrying a tray of crystal flutes. He didn't look at her, but his hand brushed hers as he reached for a drink. "The guest list is 98% checked in. Every major board member, 3 federal regulators, and the entire editorial staff of the Ledger are in the room. It's a full house, Sloane." "And the file?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "Armed. I'm just waiting for the signal," he said. He finally looked at her, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "You're sure about this? Once the slides start, there's no pulling them back." "I've spent 5 years pulling them back, Julian. Tonight I let go." She left him and headed toward the bar, but a hand gripped her elbow, tight enough to bruise. Grant Sterling leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. He looked flushed, his family values branding reinforced by the way he waved to a group of investors while simultaneously sneering at his sister. "I saw you talking to that tech guy," Grant hissed. "Don't think I don't know you're trying to lobby for a bigger severance package." "Mother told me what you said in the office yesterday. Hollow foundations. Really, Sloane, you're getting poetic in your old age." "I'm 32, Grant, and I'm not looking for a severance package." "Good, because you aren't getting one," he snapped. He looked her up and down, his lip curling. "You look like a funeral director. Go find Mrs. Gable. She's in the kitchen complaining about the hors d'oeuvres. Since you love the staff so much, maybe you can help her plate the caviar. You're certainly not doing anything useful out here." He shoved past her, intentionally clipping her shoulder. Sloane stumbled slightly, the cold condensation of a passing waiter's tray dampening her arm. She didn't lash out. She didn't even frown. She simply reached into her small, structured clutch and touched the cool, metallic surface of the remote Julian had given her. It felt like a heartbeat in her palm. She looked across the room and saw Mrs. Gable standing near the service entrance. The older woman looked uncomfortable in her formal uniform, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent space. When she caught Sloane's eye, she gave a microscopic nod. She had the documents. She was the witness they couldn't discredit, the woman who had cleaned up the Sterling messes for 20 years and finally decided she was tired of the stains. The lights in the ballroom dimmed twice, the signal that the presentation was about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur Sterling's voice boomed over the speakers, though Sloane knew Diana had written every word of the script. "If you could all take your seats. Tonight, we celebrate 10 years of the Sterling Foundation and the bright future of Sterling Global under its new leadership." The crowd began to migrate toward the stage, a sea of silk and wool moving with the slow, heavy grace of a tide. Diana took her seat in the front row, her posture perfect, her face a mask of maternal pride. Grant stood off to the side of the stage, adjusting his cuffs, checking his reflection in the polished black surface of the grand piano. He looked like a king-to-be. Sloane didn't sit. She moved to the very back of the room, standing in the shadows near the heavy oak doors. She pulled her phone from her clutch and opened a single encrypted app. Her thumb hovered over the execute button. On the massive digital screen behind the podium, the Sterling logo appeared, a golden lion, proud and invincible. "In 5 minutes," Sloane whispered to the empty air, "that lion is going to realize it's been standing on glass." She pressed the button. The screen flickered once, a tiny glitch that no one else noticed, but Sloane saw it. The countdown had shifted from minutes to seconds. She watched Grant step up to the microphone, his smile wide, his eyes bright with the reflected light of 1,000 flashbulbs. He reached out to tap the mic, the sound echoing through the silent room like a gavel. "Thank you all for coming," Grant began, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "Tonight, I want to talk to you about legacy." Sloane felt a cold, quiet peace settle over her. She looked at Julian, who was already moving toward the exit. She looked at Mrs. Gable, who had crossed her arms, waiting. Then she looked at the screen. The golden lion was still there, but beneath it, a new line of text was beginning to crawl, a string of offshore account numbers and property deeds that didn't belong to the foundation. The show was starting, and for the first time in her life, Sloane Sterling wasn't the one behind the scenes fixing the disaster. She was the one who had built it. Grant stood frozen behind the microphone, his hand still raised in a gesture of practiced triumph. The hum of the projector grew louder in the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. Behind him, the golden lion of the Sterling Foundation was eclipsed by a jagged spreadsheet of offshore transfers. The scent of 1,000 expensive lilies, meant to evoke elegance, now felt cloying, like the air in a funeral parlor. "There seems to be a technical glitch," Grant said, his voice cracking as he forced a chuckle. He looked toward the wings, expecting the tech team to kill the feed. "Sloane, dear, could you tell the AV crew to reset the loop?" Sloane Sterling didn't move. She stood near the front table, her minimalist charcoal gown a stark contrast to the shimmering sequins and designer tuxedos surrounding her. She felt the cool weight of the remote in her palm, hidden in the folds of her dress. She didn't look at the screen, she looked directly at her brother. "It's not a glitch, Grant," she said, her voice low but amplified by the stillness of the room. "It's a ledger." A ripple of whispers broke out. Diana Sterling leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light as she hissed, "Sloane, sit down. You're making a scene." Arthur Sterling remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the specific line item on the screen that detailed a $3 million consulting fee paid to a shell company in the Caymans. Grant's face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The bronze tan he'd cultivated in the Hamptons seemed to curdle, turning a sickly, translucent gray that made the sweat on his forehead shimmer like oil under the stage lights. His mouth, usually curved in a smirk of effortless superiority, fell open, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch. His eyes, wide and glassy, darted frantically from the screen to the silent, judging faces of the board members, the pupils shrinking until they were nothing more than pinpricks of pure terror. The arrogant lines of his posture collapsed, his shoulders hunching as if he were trying to shrink away from the digital evidence of his own greed. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage was electrified. "This is a fabrication," Grant stammered, his fingers fumbling with the silk of his tie. "A disgruntled employee's attempt at—" "I'm not an employee, Grant," Sloane interrupted, stepping into the light of the podium. "I was the architect of your silence, but I've decided to stop building walls and start opening doors." She pressed a button on the remote. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a high-definition video. The audio hissed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art speakers. It was Grant's voice, clear and dripping with the casual cruelty he usually reserved for the staff. "Just move the funds from the pediatric wing account," the recorded Grant said. "Sloane will bury the paper trail. She's the family dog. She does what she's told." The gasp from the audience was collective, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Mrs. Gable, standing near the service entrance, didn't hide her smile. She caught Sloane's eye and gave a single, sharp nod of validation. Julian Vance stood by the exit, his arms crossed, his phone already live-streaming the entire event to every major news outlet in the city. Grant reached out, trying to grab the microphone, but his hand was shaking so violently he knocked the water glass over instead. The sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot. "You think you can do this?" Grant hissed, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper as he leaned over the podium toward her. "You're a Sterling. If I go down, the name goes with me. You'll be nothing." Sloane looked at him, and for the first time in 26 years, she felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no resentment, no longing for a seat at the table she now realized was rotten to the core. "The name was already dead, Grant," she said, her voice like a blade of ice. "I'm just the one finally performing the autopsy." She turned her back on him before he could respond. She felt the heat of the stage lights on her neck one last time as she stepped down the stairs. The board members were already rising, their faces masks of professional distance as they began to move away from Grant as if his failure were contagious. Diana was weeping into a silk handkerchief, not for her son, but for the social calendar that was evaporating in real time. Sloane walked past Julian, who held the door open for her. She didn't stop to watch the security guards approach the stage. She didn't wait for the inevitable shouting match or the flurry of lawyers. She walked through the foyer, the sound of her heels on the marble floor steady and rhythmic. As she reached the heavy oak doors of the estate, she paused. The night air was sharp and clean, smelling of rain and damp earth. She pulled the small, encrypted drive from her purse, the last of the backups, and dropped it into the deep stone fountain by the entrance. She didn't look back at the house. She got into the car where Julian was already waiting, the engine a low, powerful hum in the dark. "Is it done?" Julian asked. Sloane looked at the glowing screen of her phone where the first headline had already popped. "Sterling Foundation Scandal. The Architect Speaks." "No," she said, leaning her head back against the leather seat. "It's just beginning." The minutes following the exit from the estate felt like the pressurized silence before a deep-sea implosion. Inside the sleek, darkened cabin of the car, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet pavement and the frantic, muffled chirping of Sloane Sterling's phone. She didn't answer it. She didn't even look at the screen, which illuminated her face in rhythmic pulses of ghostly blue light. Beside her, Julian Vance kept his eyes on the road, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel, though the sharp set of his jaw betrayed his focus. "The server is holding," Julian said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "The traffic to the exposé is peaking. Your mother is currently the most searched name in the tri-state area, and not for her charity work." Back at the Sterling estate, the air had turned toxic. The scent of expensive lilies and imported catering now felt cloying, like the atmosphere of a funeral held before the body was even cold. Diana Sterling stood in the center of the grand foyer, her phone clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles were white against her manicured skin. The carefully applied layers of foundation couldn't hide the sudden, gray pallor that washed over her face as she scrolled through the first wave of headlines. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, became glassy and darted around the room as if looking for a door that wasn't there. Her jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, her perfectly lined lips trembling as the first wave of social death settled into her bones. The woman who had spent 30 years crafting a legacy of family values was watching the pedestal crumble into fine, gritty dust beneath her designer heels. "This is a glitch," Diana whispered, though no one was listening. "It's a hack. Grant, call the PR team. Call everyone." Grant Sterling didn't move. He was slumped against the mahogany sideboard, his face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. His phone was vibrating so violently against the wood that it sounded like a dying insect. He had just watched his largest sponsor, a global athletic brand that banked on his clean image, scrub his face from their social media headers in real time. The arrogance that usually defined his posture had vanished, replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. "They dropped me, Mom," Grant rasped, his voice cracking. "They didn't even call, I'm gone. Everything is gone." He looked at the screen again, seeing the video Mrs. Gable had provided, the one where he had laughed about the help being disposable. The witness validation was instant and brutal. In the corner of the room, Arthur Sterling sat in a high-backed leather chair, looking older than he had 10 minutes ago. He didn't look at his wife or his son. He stared at the empty space where Sloane had stood, the silence of his own complicity finally weighing down on him like lead. The guests were no longer whispering, they were fleeing. The old money crowd, who Diana had courted with such ferocity, were slipping out the side exits, their faces turned away to avoid being caught in the blast radius of the Sterling brand's disintegration. Mrs. Gable stood by the coat rack, watching them go with a look of weary satisfaction. She had waited a long time to see the masks slip. The phone in Sloane's lap buzzed again. This time, she picked it up. It was a FaceTime call from Diana. Sloane swiped to accept, holding the device so the camera captured only her eyes. Cold, steady, and entirely unmoved. "Sloane," Diana's voice was a jagged shriek, stripped of its usual melodic poise. "You listen to me. You are going to take that down. You are going to tell them it was a lie, a mental breakdown, anything. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed your brother's life. You've destroyed this family." "No, Diana," Sloane said, her voice a low, lethal contrast to her mother's hysteria. "I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped hiding the wreckage you created. You spent 20 years treating me like a ghost in my own home. You used my talent to build Grant's career, and then tried to bury me when I asked for a seat at the table. You're a monster," Grant yelled in the background, his voice muffled by his own panic. "You're just jealous because you never had what I have." Sloane felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the wine stain on her dress from years ago, the one Diana had told her to wear with pride because she wasn't worth the cost of a new one. "What you have, Grant, was bought with my silence," Sloane said, "and I'm officially out of stock." "Sloane, please," Arthur's voice broke in, sounding hollow. "Think about the legacy. Think about the Sterling name." "The Sterling name belongs to me now, Dad," Sloane replied. "I filed the paperwork this morning. Since the foundation was funded primarily through the trusts you signed over to me to minimize taxes 5 years ago, I've frozen the accounts. The estate, the cars, the branding, it's all tied to the foundation. And as of 10 minutes ago, the board has voted to remove Diana and Grant from all positions, effective immediately." The silence on the other end of the line was visceral. Sloane could almost hear the sound of Diana's heart hammering against her ribs. The power inversion was complete. The quiet luxury Sloane had adopted wasn't just a style. It was the shroud she had used to move unnoticed while she dismantled their world piece by piece. "You can't do that," Diana breathed, her voice failing. "Where are we supposed to go?" "You have 30 days to vacate the estate," Sloane said, her thumb hovering over the end call button. "I'd suggest you start packing the designer whites, Diana. I hear the resale market for old money aesthetics is quite high this season. You'll need the cash for the legal fees." Sloane disconnected. She leaned her head back against the leather seat and closed her eyes, the smell of Julian's expensive cologne and the faint scent of rain from the open window filling her senses. The rage that had fueled her for a decade didn't vanish, but it settled into something cooler, something that felt like peace. "What now?" Julian asked softly. Sloane looked out the window as the city lights blurred past, a sea of possibilities where she was no longer a ghost, but the architect of her own future. "Now," Sloane said, "we watch the dust settle." 6 months had passed since the gates of the Sterling estate had clicked shut behind Diana and Grant for the last time. In the high-stakes world of Manhattan public relations, half a year was an eternity, enough time for a scandal to fossilize into a cautionary tale. For Sloane Sterling, it was the first time in a decade she had been able to breathe without the scent of her mother's suffocating lilies clogging her lungs. She stood in her new office on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel monolith in Tribeca. There were no oil paintings of ancestors who had built their wealth on the backs of others, no velvet curtains to hide the rot. The space was all light and sharp angles, smelling of expensive espresso and the ozone of a looming summer storm. Sloane smoothed the front of her charcoal silk trousers, the fabric cool against her skin. This was quiet luxury, not as a costume, but as a fortress. A soft chime echoed from her desk. She didn't have to look to know it was Julian. He was the only one who used the encrypted line. "The final auction results are in," Julian Vance said, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet room. "The estate's contents, the Ming vases, the 1920s vanity, even the custom tennis White's Grant insisted on keeping in his trophy room. It's all gone. The proceeds have been liquidated into the trust for the victims of Grant's previous mishaps." Sloane leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the tiny, ant-like cars crawl along the FDR drive. "And Diana?" "She's moved," Julian replied, and she could hear the faint tapping of keys as he pulled up the data. "She's in a 2-bedroom rental in Queens. No doorman, no garden. I'm told she spent the morning arguing with the super about the water pressure. Apparently she tried to tell him she was a Sterling, and he asked her if that was a brand of silverware." The image of Diana Sterling, the woman who once dictated the guest list for the Met Gala, haggling with a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit, brought a sharp, cold spike of satisfaction to Sloane's chest. It was the face slap that kept on giving, the slow, agonizing realization that without the Sterling name and the Sterling vault, Diana was just another aging woman in a city that didn't care about her pedigree. "And Grant?" Sloane asked. "Consulting, or trying to. He's using a pseudonym, but the industry is small. Every time he gets close to a contract, a copy of the Chappaqua recording finds its way to the board of directors. He's currently living in Diana's spare room. Mrs. Gable says the shouting matches can be heard from the street." Sloane closed her eyes. She could almost see it, the two of them trapped in a beige box, surrounded by the ghosts of their own arrogance, blaming each other for the vacuum where their lives used to be. It was a karmic inheritance they had earned with every lie and every dismissal. The door to her office opened and Julian stepped in. He didn't look like the tech shadow he had been during their campaign. He looked like a man who had finally stepped into the light. He crossed the room and handed her a heavy silver-capped pen, a gift for the official opening of her firm. "You did it, Sloane," he whispered, his hand lingering on hers. "I did," she said, but the words felt heavier than she expected. She thought of Arthur Sterling. Her father had reached out once a month ago. He was living in a quiet cottage in Connecticut, finally free from Diana's shadow, but seemingly hollowed out by the silence. He hadn't asked her to come home. He knew, as she did, that home was a crime scene they could never revisit. He had offered a muffled apology for the years of silence, but Sloane had realized that some silences were too deep to be filled by a single phone call. That was the cost. She had won the war, reclaimed the wealth, and dismantled the monsters, but she had also confirmed the one thing she had spent her life trying to deny. The people who were supposed to love her were only capable of loving a version of her that served them. She looked down at her desk, where a single photograph sat. It wasn't of her family. It was a candid shot Julian had taken of her at a small cafe in Paris, weeks after the reveal. She was laughing, her face unburdened, her eyes bright. The phone buzzed again, a new client, a high-profile CEO facing a crisis of character. They didn't want a momager to spin a lie. They wanted Sloane Sterling to tell them the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Julian," she said, her voice regaining its professional edge, the cold precision that had become her greatest asset. "Call the auditors. I want a full review of the new acquisition by noon." She turned away from the window, leaving the view of the city behind. The Sterling legacy was dead, buried under the weight of its own vanity. In its place stood something sturdier, something built on the truth she had fought to uncover. As she sat at her desk, the heavy silver pen felt balanced in her hand. She wasn't a ghost anymore, and she wasn't a victim. She was the architect, and for the first time in her life, the blueprint belonged entirely to her. The dust had settled, and beneath it, she had found a foundation that wouldn't crumble. She picked up the phone. "This is Sloane Sterling," she said, and the name finally sounded like hers.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.